Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I am joined by PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nate, the great Jahnke. Nate, we're live once again on the YouTubes, out into the Twitterverse, looking to get the good folks set here with a lot of different waiver wire options as we round out the first month of the season. So how you doing? You good coming out of week 3?
Yeah, good. Had the doubleheader on Monday night, so that was always interesting, but a good week. Not too many injuries, a couple here and there, but still a lot of interesting waiver wire conversations. A lot of teams doing different stuff at running back, at tight end, so definitely a lot to get into.
Yeah, there's plenty here. We won't waste a lot of time. And yeah, the Monday double header. It's not even a double header. You can't call it that. It can't overlap the games. Anyways, whatever. It's at least the Buffalo Jaguars game was out of hand quickly before the Bengals game started, so we didn't have to care about that one. But yeah, like I said, we're live again. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. We'll get to them as we kind of go through our list here. We'll reference rostership percentages as well. Those are pulled from ESPN. But we will get into our waiver wire targets here in just a sec. But first, a quick shout out to our friends at DraftKings. TD, Tutty, taking it to the house, in for 6, whatever you call a touchdown. One thing's for sure, touchdowns matter more at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. On the ground, in the air, from the special teams or defense, we don't care how they score them. We want to bet on touchdowns, and DraftKings Sportsbook is the #1 place to bet touchdowns. Ready to place your first NFL bet? Try betting on something simple like a player to score a touchdown. Go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app and make your bet today. Ready to do a touchdown dance on your own? New DraftKings customers can bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Score big with the DraftKings Sportsbook, the #1 place to bet touchdowns. Download the Sportsbook app and use code PFF. That's code PFF for new customers to get $200 in bonus bets when you bet just $5 only at DraftKings Sportsbook. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly on behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort, Kansas. 21 plus age and eligibility varies by jurisdiction. Void in Ontario. Bonus bets expire 168 hours after issuance. For additional terms and resources, responsible gaming resources, see dkng.co/ftball. All right, Nate, let's do this thing. And we'll start with the running back position with a name that we've talked about each week on this waiver wire show so far, but maybe not much longer because his involvement is growing. So Bucky Irving makes the list once again, rostered in 32.7% of leagues right now, Nate.
Yeah, Irving had been leading the team in rushing yards each of the first 2 weeks, and this week he did it again, but he also led the team in rushing attempts. So his playing time hasn't really changed over these first few weeks. It's still been Rachaad White getting the majority of the early down snaps, all of the goal line work, all of the passing down work, expecting White to at least keep the passing down work. But Irving has been playing significantly better than White in the run game, even though the offensive line hasn't really helped either of the running backs. But Irving has been able to do more despite the offensive line than White's been able to do. And the coach said yesterday that Irving's played well enough that he's earned more playing time. So I think Irving is the one running back, we'll talk about that, has both the potential to be a fantasy starter in the near future as well as a clear fantasy starter the rest of the season. Looked at other rookie running backs over the past 5 years who have played this well early in the season. And basically every rookie that has 100 yards over the first 3 weeks ends up as a top 20 running back or so for fantasy. It's been 11 of the 13 over the past previous 4 seasons. So I think White has a pretty decent chance, or Irving has a pretty decent chance of being a fantasy starter down the stretch and is the only running back here where I'm pretty confident that'll be the case.
I think it makes sense. I mean, 9 carries for 70 yards, 7.8 yards per carry in this game, 76.8 rushing yards or rushing grade. Like Rachaad White just hasn't looked good. And also worth noting, like you said, like Todd Bowles said that he's probably earned more work, but like Tampa Bay was trailing for a lot of this game. So Rachaad White was going to get more involved because of their, passing a lot more, which they definitely did a lot more this week. I think through the first 2 weeks of the year, they only passed on 59% of their offensive snaps. And then this week they passed on 72% of the offensive plays. So makes sense that, snaps were pretty one-sided in favor of Rachaad White this week, but thinking like in more favorable game scripts as well, like Bucky Irving could get a lot more use and close that gap even more in the next couple of weeks. Okay, next man up has been the next man up for the Houston Texans, who were without Joe Mixon this week. We talked about Cam Akers last week, but now that we actually got a game without Joe Mixon in the lineup, how did things shake out for Cam Akers this week?
Yeah, Akers had basically the exact same role Joe Mixon had in week one, the same role that we saw Devin Singletary have in this offense a lot last season. Akers had the clear early down work, and then it was someone else taking the passing down work. Daryl Gunblale has had that role so far this season. We did see J.J. Taylor get a bit involved, but that was just in the fourth quarter because the game got a little out of reach. But Akers played 29 of a possible 32 snaps on first and second down outside of the 2-minute drill with the first three quarters. So it was clearly Akers for most of the game. We knew this wasn't a great matchup against the Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings have a strong run defense. I know at least after the first 2 weeks, they had the highest graded run defense. Haven't checked their ranking since that point, but they have a better matchup against Jacksonville this upcoming week. So we don't know the injury status of both Joe Mixon and Dameon Pierce. It'll probably take both players being out in order for Akers to be a fantasy starter. But if both players are out, then I would be a lot more confident putting Akers in my starting lineup this week than I was last week.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I mean, Texans were another team, like you said, they were just playing from behind a lot. So they didn't really get a chance to run at all, just 11 backfield carries in this game. And Akers took all of them except for 2. So that was definitely promising, especially if Mixon and Pierce miss more time. Okay, Nate, a late addition to the waiver target list this week out of Pittsburgh, both Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris are apparently banged up. So Cordero Patterson becomes relevant again, rostered in less than 1% of leagues. Anything from Cordero Patterson's usage over the past 3 weeks that makes him stand out as more intriguing, or in case it's, just one of these starters that's able to go in week 4?
Yeah, Patterson was used as a wide receiver mostly this past week. I got so distracted by the fact that he played so much that I wasn't even paying attention to the running backs when I was writing the recap article because Van Jefferson also suffered an eye injury. So I thought, okay, maybe Jefferson was out, which is why Patterson was playing so much. But Patterson was mixing in at slot receiver before Jefferson was out, cutting into Calvin Austin's playing time, and then Austin ended up having a good game. But Jaylen Warren in the third quarter or so was pulled from the game. They said he just wasn't looking right as a runner. I think had an MRI yesterday. I haven't heard anything about the results of that. But then we also heard after the game that Najee Harris was in a sling in his right arm after the game. So at both running backs can't go, then it's Cordero Patterson, who's the next man up. Only took a couple snaps at running back last week late in the game after Warren was pulled. But Patterson has been in Arthur Smith's offense for 4 seasons now. Last season, when Bijan Robinson had his game where he was having migraines, they trusted Patterson for 10 carries in that game. And then the year before Bijan Robinson was on the team, before Tyler Algier really broke out, Patterson was pretty consistently having a clear workhorse role in the Falcons offense just 2 years ago. So I think the Arthur Smith trusts Patterson to be an every down guy despite his age. I know he's now 2 years older than he was last time he had 20 plus carries, but I think there's a decent chance that Patterson ends up being the guy this week. So he is someone specifically, if you want a running back for this upcoming week, plays the Colts, which is an average matchup for running backs in general. So if you could only get one of Akers or Patterson, I would lean Akers, but I think Patterson available in a lot more leagues. So especially in some of these deeper leagues, Patterson is probably the best guy that you can get.
Yep, makes sense to me. Okay, Nate, we're getting some interesting usage in Chicago with these running backs, so much so that DeAndre Swift's role just keeps getting scaled back, it seems. And now with Roschon Johnson back in the mix, how did this backfield shake out with him in this week?
Sure. So Travis Homer, who had been the third down running back, landed on injured reserve, which is why Roschon Johnson, who was a healthy and active recently, was part of the lineup this week. Johnson took over on third downs. He was the clear 2-minute drill back as well. That was something where Swift was mixing in more. And then we saw Khalil Herbert take more snaps at the goal line. Typically, teams don't have this many goal line snaps. So the fact that Herbert played this much at the goal line and played more at the goal line than he did on any other situation made it clear that Swift was scaling back in that situation as well. So Swift right now only has a clear hold on the early down role, and I don't know how much longer that's going to stay because Swift has not played well this season. Part of it's definitely the offensive line, but other running backs have done a little bit better despite the offensive line. Swift only 1 first down carry in the first 3 weeks. Johnson had 3 first down carries in this game. So I would not be surprised if Swift's playing time starts to get scaled back, which is why I think the Bears running backs are a bit more interesting now. Johnson was the one to get the majority of the carries outside of Swift, which is why Johnson is the player that I have here. Plus, I think Johnson's role is a bit more secure as the passing down back, at least for while Travis Homer is out. So he's probably the running back of the two that I would target. I think in some leagues, Herbert's also worth taking a flyer on because there's a chance that Herbert also could become the early down back. It's not clear at this point. There was only 1 snap difference between the two on early downs, but we could also see a case where Travis Homer is back in a month and Travis Homer is mixing in more as well. But this could very well be a running backfield to avoid completely, but in some leagues you don't have the luxury of getting to avoid it, in which case Roschon Johnson is probably the running back that I would get between him and Khalil Herbert.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, you see the usage there up on the screen, and in PPR leagues especially, like Johnson at least becomes a very interesting name to consider dominating the 2-minute drill work and third down work there. And yeah, like Swift's getting the early down work, but this is also another one of those teams that just hasn't been able to run the ball much because they haven't had the luxury of playing with the lead too often, and not sure how much that's going to change over the next few weeks. So definitely makes sense to kind of look over at Roschon Johnson as somebody that's of interest there. Okay, a couple of other new names to the list here, Nate, and a couple guys that aren't rostered in many leagues at all, both rostered in under 2% of ESPN leagues, starting with Emmanuel Wilson of the Green Bay Packers.
Sure. So A.J. Dillon out for the season on injured reserve, not coming back this year. Marshawn Lloyd dealing with injuries throughout the preseason, missed week 1. They tried him for week 2 and then decided to put him on injured reserve after the week. So that means Emmanuel Wilson is the number 2 running back for Green Bay for at least the foreseeable future. In this game, the Packers were winning by a bit, so Emmanuel Wilson ended up seeing nearly half of the early down work, seeing nearly half of the third down work. I think a big part of that was simply the lead that the Packers had. They ran Josh Jacobs a ton last week. He's among the top, I think, 3 running backs in rushing attempts this season. So I'm not all that surprised that Josh Jacobs didn't play as much in this game. I think a lot of it had to do with the game script and how much he was worked last week. So not expecting a ton out of Wilson, but I do think if there's games like this where the Packers are winning by a lot, Wilson will have some value, and he's also the handcuff that if something were to happen to Josh Jacobs, Emmanuel Wilson would be the clear guy in this offense. So that's why he's listed and he's available in the vast majority of leagues. So some deeper leagues are probably more so where I'm looking to pick him up.
Yeah, makes sense. I like Josh Jacobs this week. Pretty disappointing game where I thought he should have probably performed better considering the matchup. Just 43 yards on 19 carries. In a win, the recipe for success was there, but just couldn't string anything impressive together. But yeah, like you said, it was more, game script. The carries in the first 3 quarters were 14-6 in favor of Jacobs, and then Wilson went 6-3 in favor of carries over Jacobs in the fourth quarter when the game was pretty much out of reach. But it makes sense that, again, if the Packers have the lead again and just being that immediate handcuff to Josh Jacobs, there's definitely value there. So, speaking of running backs that got the majority of work late in the game that was out of reach, Tyler Batty emerges in week 3 with 9 carries for 70 yards. Nate, another mouth to feed in this Broncos backfield now.
Yeah, Tyler started the offseason as a 5th running back on the depth chart, but then they cut Samaje Perine. Estime is on injured reserve, so that bumped him up to the 3rd running back spot. In the first 2 weeks, it was very much a 2-man committee. The 3rd running back only saw 3 snaps in each of the first 2 games. But then over the first 3 quarters, Tyler mixed in slightly more than he had the first 2 weeks, playing, I think, just 4 snaps in those first 3 quarters. But then in the fourth quarter, in the last 10 minutes, they gave him the backfield, and he was the best performing running back of the Broncos basically so far this season. So even though it was just fourth quarter work, I wouldn't be surprised if they mix in Tyler a little more in the future, just considering how well he played compared to how well the other Broncos running backs played. So a chance he just goes back to being the third running back and not seeing any playing time whatsoever, which is entirely possible. But there's also a chance he starts seeing more playing time. So a bit more of a speculative ad, and especially with Estime ideally coming back sometime in the next couple weeks, that'll just complicate the backfield even more. So this is probably going to be one of the more complicated backfields, but for a running back who's available in basically every single league, if you're looking for a pretty deep cut, I think Tyler is a running back to consider.
Yeah, I appreciate you avoiding the pronunciation of the last name, because I don't know if it's Batty or Beatty either. So yeah, Tyler there. Yeah, just work it in, right? Because it like you look at the usage, it's still like pretty clearly Javonte Williams backfield, like working, 2-minute drill, goal line, early downs, third downs. Like he's getting work in all situations. There's just always like kind of reason for concern there when there's more options to emerge who could potentially get usage in those situations. So makes it another messy backfield situation to have to sort out here for fantasy purposes potentially. So some of the repeat names from previous weeks are still available here, Nate. I'll run through the names here, and then you feel free to expand on anyone worth updating from these last few weeks. Rico Dowdle of the Dallas Cowboys rostered in 37% of leagues. Braylon Allen of the New York Jets in 28% of leagues. Tyrone Tracy of the New York Giants in 6% of leagues. Tank Bigsby of the Jacksonville Jaguars in 10% of leagues. And Ray Davis of the Buffalo Bills also in 10% of leagues. Anybody... Any situations change there at all from these names that have been on the list?
Oh, sure. Cowboys situation has changed. Hunter Lupke, their fullback / halfback, took over as the third down back, which isn't great news for Dowdle, but Dowdle also stopped being in a clear rotation by drive. Dowdle took the first 2 drives on the early downs. Ezekiel Elliott getting phased out of the offense a bit. So it's possible Dowdle takes over as the full early down back for Dallas. I think that's at least within the realm of possibility. And the Cowboys have been blown out the last 2 games. I would expect them to turn things around at some point this season, in which case they would be running the ball more often. So wouldn't be surprised if Dowdle reaches double-digit carries. With the Jets, Braylon Allen did mix in more throughout the game. Week 2, it was just a couple of drives where he mixed in, but this was throughout the game. So definitely a chance Allen has some standalone value in games where the Jets are winning by a bit. Tyrone Tracy also played a little bit more this week than he had the first 2 weeks. So Devin Singletary still playing well. I'd say Singletary is probably playing a little bit better than Tracy. So I'm not all that confident that Tracy takes over the backfield, but at least getting a little bit more playing time this week than the previous week.
Makes sense. All right, let's look at the wide receivers now, where there are a lot more names available here as well. And we have to start with the week 3 wide receiver 1, Juwan Jennings, Nate. Every once in a while, there are players on the waiver list that you probably don't have to tell people about because they put up these kinds of performances. But for those that aren't aware of Jennings' big day, what's got him at the very top of the waiver wire targets this week?
Yeah, he caught 3 touchdowns, graded out very well as one of the top wide receivers on the season just from this one game alone. So had an excellent week. A lot of it had to do with Deebo Samuel being out with injury. So I wasn't even positive that Jennings was going to have this full role in the 49ers offense. We saw a lot of Chris Conley in 21 personnel over the first 2 weeks. So I thought Conley would mix in more in 2 wide receiver sets, but it was pretty consistently Jennings on the field. So Jennings had that full-time role that we weren't expecting, and Brandon Ayuk double covered a lot. So that meant throwing the ball to Jennings, and Jennings did an excellent job, had lots of great catches, graded very well as a receiver in this game. So I think the clear top wide receiver option off the waiver wire, because you're going to be probably starting him at least the next week or 2. There's the obvious caveats that George Kittle could be back next week. That will impact Jennings' target share. Deebo Samuel will come back sometime. Samuel will regain the starting role when he's back, relegating Jennings back to the third receiver role. Ricky Purcell hopefully coming back off of the injured list sometime this season also could cut into Jennings' playing time. And if Christian McCaffrey comes back this season, that'll give the 49ers more of a passing threat out of the backfield, even though running the ball, they've been doing just fine. So Jennings, not expecting him to be a long-term option in fantasy whatsoever, but in terms of short-term options, you're not going to find too much better of an option off the waiver wire at wide receiver.
Yeah. Hell of a game by him. I think it was the one, the kind of game we were all envisioning for Brandon Ayuk this week. But nope, Jawan Jennings comes through with the 12 targets, 175 yards, and 3 touchdowns. But we will take it if we can get him off the waiver wire. So here's a familiar name from this list, and one that we actually haven't seen until this week for the first time. Josh Downs comes back for the Colts. How did things look for him this week in his first game back?
Things look decently well considering he's been out for a while with injury. He had a high target share last year for the Colts. Typically, I shy away from guys who are specifically slot receivers and 11 personnel, but the Colts run so much 11 personnel that I'm a little bit more okay with Downs than most slot receivers. And he played 32 of a possible 41 snaps out of 11 personnel. Still opportunity for him to gain a little bit more snaps, but I also would not have been surprised if he had played less snaps this week, considering he's been out for well over a month at this point. Had a high target share when he was on the field, 31% target rate, comparing his targets to his routes run, which is excellent for a wide receiver. So I would not be surprised if he becomes the Colts' top passing option in this offense. Michael Pittman hasn't been doing too much this season. We've seen the big plays out of Alec Pierce, but not necessarily a consistent high volume of catches. So I would not be at all surprised if Downs is the player that leads the team in receptions over the course of the rest of the season. Obviously need the Colts passing game to be more consistent in order for that to happen, but I think Downs can add to that consistency. So even though he didn't put up a high stat total for this week, I think he has probably the best chance of any of the wide receivers here to lead his team in targets over the rest of the season.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that was kind of, the whole point of having him on this list the first 2 weeks, right? Like he didn't, necessarily cut into Alec Pierce's overall playing time, but he did command that target rate. That was kind of the point of going after him in the first place. Like that usage out of the slot, making himself a quarterback friendly target for Anthony Richardson. And like you said, 31% target rate led all the Colts receiving options who ran at least 5 routes. So that was definitely promising to see there for Josh Downs. Some newer names to the list, and let's start with the rookie final pick of the first round of this year's NFL draft. Nate, Xavier Legette could see his role grow here depending on how Adam Thielen is doing going forward, and we'll maybe tie into one of the chat questions here because it's regarding also a Carolina Panthers wide receiver. I'll pull up, but let's talk about Xavier Legette first, who's rostered in 20% of ESPN leagues.
Sure. First off, the Panthers offense did a lot better this week with Andy Dalton at quarterback, so that helps everyone in the offense. Before Adam Thielen suffered his injury, we saw a little bit of a change in how the Panthers were using their wide receivers. They were using Xavier Legette pretty specifically in 2 wide receiver sets with Deontay Johnson, and then Legette wasn't playing as much in 11 personnel. They kind of stuck with Johnson, Thielen, and Mingo as their 3 wide receiver set wide receivers. So that wasn't going to be great for Legette because he was mixing in more in 11 personnel. But then Thielen suffered his injury, which kind of turned Legette into an every down receiver. Jonathan Mingo moved from the outside to the slot in 11 personnel. So Legette was pretty much a primary receiver in both 11 and 12 personnel on the outside. And I would expect that to be the case for as long as Thielen is out. And I think that gives Legette a chance to kind of earn that number 2 wide receiver role in this offense. Tight end, they've kind of been changing how they're using their tight ends. Not expecting many targets out of them. So if the Panthers offense is doing better in general with Andy Dalton at quarterback, I think there's a chance that there can be 2 fantasy relevant receivers in this offense, in which case Legette is probably that guy that's going to be the number 2, especially if Adam Thielen's going to miss time.
Yeah, I'm with you. Like just the 10% target rate, nothing crazy there in week 3. Didn't have a target in week 2. But we kind of saw him get decent usage in week 1, right? Including a team leading 7 targets for a 30% target rate that week. So definitely some potential there. And we've at least seen him kind of be a strong target earner in one of the 3 weeks already this season. So if he does get that number 2 role, that could definitely be promising. Now, regarding the number 1 role, Deontay Johnson, we did get a question from Zik, not Zach. He's missing the A. He says, I got a predicament. Deontay Johnson's on my waiver wire. I want to pick him up, but I don't know who to drop, either JSN, Jameson Williams, George Pickens, or even T. Higgins at this point. Anybody that you're preferring Deontay Johnson over from that group, Nate?
I believe in my rest of season rankings, I have Johnson as the lowest out of that group. I think if he's in a league where he's on the waiver wire, I'm assuming it's either a team with lighter benches or a 10-team league, although that is also a lot of wide receivers to have on the roster. I'm probably still leaving Johnson on the bench. I think Johnson probably has more consistency than Pickens or Higgins will have, but I also think Pickens and Higgins will have higher upside compared to Johnson in general, and not getting rid of Jameson or Jackson Smith-Njigba at this point. So I might just leave him on the waiver wire and let someone else spend a lot on him, because I'm not sure I want to get rid of any of those other wide receivers.
Yep, there we go. All right, now last week we talked about Demarcus Robinson, who of course vaulted up the rostership ranks with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua out. But we kind of knew there would be another option in there, especially for a team that runs such a high rate of 11 personnel. So Nate, Tutu Atwell gets on the list for you this week. How did his usage shake out here in week 3?
Yeah, he ended up being a starter in this game, even though it was Tyler Johnson who got the work once Puka Nacua got down. It was Jordan Whittington once Cooper Kupp went down. So it was 3 other wide receivers that we were talking about potentially seeing playing time and seeing targets. But it ended up being Tutu Atwell starting and seeing the majority of the snaps in this game. It was really Johnson and Whittington who kind of rotated in that third wide receiver spot. Atwell made some big plays, ended up with a lot more receiving yards than all the other players. I'm not fully trusting it. I wouldn't be surprised if the Rams change up what they're doing again next week. I wouldn't be surprised if Atwell sees playing time but doesn't see the targets again. So not fully trusting it, but after he had a decent game this week, and after last season when he had a couple of okay games before getting benched for Demarcus Robinson, there's a chance that Atwell becomes the number 1 wide receiver for the Rams these next few weeks. And I'd probably rather add him to the roster now, see if he does this a second week before putting him on a starting lineup. But I also don't want to just leave him on the waiver wire and then him go off again and then have it be a lot harder to pick him up the following week.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. It was nice to see the usage there. 27 routes out of a possible 33 for him, so 82% route participation. I think only Demarcus Robinson and Colby Parkinson ran more routes, and then guys like Tyler Johnson, just 48% route participation. Jordan Whittington, 30% route participation. So definitely promising usage there for Tutu Atwell. But yeah, I'm with you. I think you pick him up and leave him on the bench to just see some, consistency for one more week here before we trust them. But he did show it a little bit in flashes last year with Matthew Stafford, so that was a nice promising sign as well. Okay, Jordan Addison is still out there for the Minnesota Vikings, and Jalen Nailor has been pretty effective in his absence. Nate, available in over 95% of leagues still. What do we think of Jalen Nailor heading into week 4?
It sounds like the Vikings are a little more optimistic that Jordan Addison might be back this week, so I'm not sure what to think. If Addison misses more time, then I'm definitely a lot more comfortable with Nailor. I am concerned about how much playing time Nailor will get once all of the wide receivers are healthy again. We saw in week 1, before there were any injuries, Powell seeing more snaps than Nailor. Even though Nailor, I believe, is a more talented receiver, I think a lot of people agree with that opinion. But Nailor and Jefferson and Addison are all primarily outside wide receivers, where Powell is a primary slot receiver. So I think that's what gave Powell the edge in week 1, and I would not be all that surprised if that gives Powell an edge going forward once everyone is healthy. So Nailor, Addison misses another game, perfectly happy to pick him up and potentially start him again. But I think once everyone is healthy, I would need to see Nailor play significantly more than Powell before I would consider trusting him with all 3 wide receivers healthy.
Gotcha. Okay, another player with a pretty impressive performance on Sunday, Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals, earned 9 targets, brought in 8 for 64 yards. What did we like about Michael Wilson in Arizona, Nate?
He's someone that I liked for a while. He played well pretty a bit early last season, played well the last week of last season. We know he has that starting role, seeing a high number of routes run each week. So he always had that. It just the first 2 weeks he wasn't seeing nearly enough targets. This week he did see a bit more targets and played well with them. So that was really good to see out of Wilson. I'm not sure if it'll continue. I know Trey McBride might be out this upcoming week, so that probably elevates Wilson to be that clear number 2 target in the offense rather than the number 3 target. So specifically this week, he might be fine. And there's also a chance that he's just gained that chemistry with Kyler Murray now, and he could be a clear third part of the offense. The offense at times has played well enough that it's worth considering 3 receivers in the offense, but Greg Dortch also seeing a decent number of targets. So I'm not sure when or how much I will trust him over the course of the entire season, but there's a chance I would trust him a little bit more specifically this week.
Yeah. Nice to see. I think he was second on the team in routes run behind Marvin Harrison Jr. Trey McBride also in the concussion protocol as well, so could make Michael Wilson an option again this coming week. So lastly, just some of the repeat names from previous weeks here. We got Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants rostered in 15% of leagues. Brandon Cooks of the Dallas Cowboys rostered in 34% of leagues. Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers in 43% of leagues. Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers in 26% of leagues. Jalen Polk of the New England Patriots in 19.5% of leagues. And Noah Brown of the Washington Commanders, barely rostered, 0.3% rostership percentage. So anybody that you want to touch on there? I know Noah Brown only just played last night, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. Robinson had a nice target share. His role remains the same, but he's the clear number 2 receiving option in the Giants offense. So even though he is just a slot receiver, Robinson, I think, will continue to have a high target share. Quentin Johnston scored another touchdown, so chance he continues to break out in this way. Joshua Palmer did miss the game with both an elbow and calf injury, so that likely played into things a little bit with Johnston, but at least a little more optimistic that he can keep things going now that he's done it for 2 straight weeks. And then Noah Brown is probably the other interesting one from last night. Brown became the clear starting number 2 wide receiver in Washington last night. Was fairly consistently playing in 2 wide receiver sets, a couple of plays here and there where he was off the field, and then Washington ran a decent number of plays in 3 tight end sets. And when they were in 3 tight ends, Terry McLaurin was the sole wide receiver on the field, which is probably half the reason why the gap between McLaurin and Brown snaps are so high. But I think Brown going forward will be the number 2 wide receiver out of Washington. Luke McCaffrey continued to be the 3rd wide receiver in 3 wide receiver sets. So Jaden Daniels looked very good last night. Didn't need to pass the ball a ton, but I think in games where they're passing a lot, Noah Brown could have at least a decent amount of fantasy value. And like you mentioned, he is available in a ton of leagues right now.
Yeah. Jaden Daniels was awesome. And yeah, I'm with you. I think Noah Brown looks pretty solid too, and we've seen him be, a consistent NFL starter when needed. So could fit himself nicely into that second receiver role in Washington. Now, before we go on to the tight ends here, I do have a couple questions that we'll bring up in the chat regarding some wide receivers. So before we move out of that position entirely here, someone sent me a trade for Devontae. I'm guessing that's Devontae Adams for Tyreek Hill. So basically, just rest the season. Who do you prefer? I know Tyreek Hill obviously has the quarterback issues, but in a way, so does Devontae Adams. So who do you prefer here rest of the season, Nate?
I am still sticking with Tyreek. I know it was a rough game this past week, but they also had a quarterback change in the middle of the game. Until we hear more definitively how long Tua will be out for, I'm going to be a little more optimistic that he returns at least at some point this season. So even though things might be rough for the next month or so, I still think they're going to try getting Tyreek the ball as much as they possibly can. And Devontae Adams is going to have up and down games. Like it sounded like they were at least considering a quarterback change. Maybe he gets traded, but if he gets traded, he might get traded to a team where he's not the clear and obvious number 1 wide receiver. Like the Jets are the team that he's most been linked to, and they have Garrett Wilson there already. And so I'm just not as confident. I still think Devontae Adams is going to be great the rest of the season, but I have I still have Tyreek Hill a little bit higher in my rest of season rankings.
Yep, makes sense. And then just a general question of what do we think of Rome Odunze? So obviously had a big game here in week 3, scored the touchdown as well. Keenan Allen has been out. So I guess where rest of season wise do you have Rome Odunze ranked like in amongst wide receivers?
I have him wide receiver 39 rest of season. He did have that great game, but like you said, Keenan Allen was out. They also ran 90 plus offensive plays in this game. It's the most for an offense in a game so far this season, and they were passing on a lot of those plays. So the passing offense in general, not expecting them to put up as big of numbers going forward because they shouldn't run this many plays. And then once Keenan Allen's back, and if they are ever winning games or the run game starts doing better, also expect them to start running the ball a bit more. So I think talent-wise, he's shown what he can do in the NFL already, and that's great that he is playing as well as we expected him to. But all of the concerns that we had about his targets should still be a concern. He was playing basically every snap these past 2 weeks, but Keenan Allen, once he's back, could cut into those snaps into wide receiver sets as well as cutting into his targets.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay, we're going to get into tight ends and quarterbacks here in just a second, but we do have a quick ad read, and yeah, we'll kind of look at a general kind of conversation about the tight end position because it's been quite a mess so far this year. So stick with us. We will be right back. Hey everyone, this episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. As an adult, do you make time to learn new things as often as you'd like, or was that lost in childhood? Kids are always learning and growing, but as adults, sometimes we lose that curiosity. Therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder because your back-to-school era could come at any age. Therapy can be really useful to get a better understanding of how your mind actually works and to become more aware of your own patterns of behavior and how to improve them. It's useful for everybody, not just people struggling with something specific. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a convenient, flexible, and entirely online way to get therapy that's right for you. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/PFF fantasy to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/PFF fantasy. All right, Nate, we have some tight end options here, quite a few really, but we're already at the point of the season after just 3 weeks where fantasy managers are ready to ban the position across all formats because a lot of the big names have been pretty awful, unreliable, however you want to call it. Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, Sam Laporta, obviously David Njoku, Evan Ingram, Jake Ferguson have already missed games already as well, which doesn't help. So please, Nate, it's up to you now to come up with a solution for what the hell do we do with our tight ends going forward. You have 30 seconds to solve the problem. Now go. No, just kidding. But really, what do we think is the cause to this awful start? Any optimism that this will level out as the season kind of goes on here?
Yeah, I think there are probably three bigger things that are at play here. One is whatever is going on with offenses in general that's leading to fewer point totals, offensive efficiency not being as high, and has led to basically a major decline in scoring. And that has been amplified with tight ends where they just haven't been scoring touchdowns. So that's been a huge factor into this. Then I think another thing is just the injuries, like you mentioned. We've already seen Evan Ingram, David Njoku, Jake Ferguson, George Kittle, Taysom Hill all miss time. So that's a third of the tight ends that we were picking among the top 12 tight ends this season that have at least missed one game so far. And then we also had Sam Laporta and Trey McBride suffer injuries this past week, so they might miss time as well. So that's over now half the tight ends that we expected to do well missing time. So eventually, ideally, all of them will be back. I don't think anyone we know is a long-term injury, possible that we just don't know the full extent of some of these injuries so far. But ideally, at some point this season, all of the tight ends that we thought would do well will hopefully be healthy. And that's another part of it. And then I think there's been a pretty growing trend in the NFL that has happened very quickly of teams using more of a tight end by committee, like we've seen kind of running backs over the past few years, of having some pretty specific roles for tight ends. Before we started this, I looked at some data comparing the first 3 weeks of last season to the first 3 weeks of this season. Last season, there was only one team where a tight end was playing over 50% of snaps in 11 personnel and less than 50% of snaps in 12 personnel. Typically, historically, if someone was good enough to play in 11 personnel, they were also one of the top 2 tight ends to also be playing in 12 personnel. And it was just the Panthers who were going against that trend last year. And this year, so far, it's 7 teams. We have the Titans, Broncos, Dolphins, Colts, Bengals, Steelers, and Commanders, all having a tight end who is playing over 50% of snaps in 11 personnel. So like we have on the screen right now, Zach Ertz has been the guy in 11 personnel, but then they've used the other 2 tight ends in 12 personnel. So a lot of teams are doing that this year. And then we've also just last year, 15 tight ends with at least 70% of snaps in both 11 and 12 personnel, 7 of them with a target rate of at least 15%. So we had at least 7 tight ends last year that were getting both decent playing time as well as a decent target share, where this year it's only been 11 tight ends who have played at least 70% of snaps in 11 and 12 personnel. And of those 11, it's only 2 that have a target rate over 15%. So tight ends that are seeing a lot of playing time aren't getting a lot of targets. Of those 11 that are seeing a decent amount of playing time, that includes Theo Johnson of the Giants, Cade Otton of the Buccaneers, Tucker Kraft of the Packers, Johnny Munt of the Vikings, all of which are currently outside of the top 24 tight ends this season, all averaging less than 5 PPR points per game because they just aren't seeing enough targets, even though they're seeing the playing time. So there's really only 7 tight ends that are seeing good playing time and any kind of target share. Trey McBride, Dallas Goedert, Kyle Pitts, even though we have some concern about Pitt's playing time. Pitt's playing time is still better than nearly all of the tight ends in the NFL. Kelsey and Laporta, and then Colby Parkinson and Tyler Conklin, 2 of the tight ends that we are considering off the waiver wire. So, like, out of the top 12 tight ends in fantasy points this year, there's only really 4 of them that have a good role. It's Goddard, McBride, Kittle, and Pitts. Hunter Henry playing less than 70% of snaps in 11 personnel. Brock Bowers, who is having an excellent season. Cole Kmet, Isaiah Likely, Dalton Kincaid, all playing less than 60% of snaps in 11 personnel, which is last year we weren't really seeing any tight end finish in the top 12 and playing that little in 11 personnel. And then Mike Gesicki, Zach Ertz, Pat Freiermuth, all playing 30% or less in 2 tight end sets. So we're really seeing a big change in terms of tight end usage, which I think while we will get tight ends healthy again, I think we'll get offenses to start playing better again. I would not be surprised if we're still in this state of a lot of tight ends being more committees than what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent explanation of kind of what's going on too. And like, just thinking about it as you kind of talk there and, using these tight ends specifically in 11 personnel, like when offenses are in 11 personnel as well, like defense adjusts to that also, right? They put more defensive backs on the field, which is providing better coverage options against some of the, to defend the passing game, which, for a long time, there was a lot more linebackers on the field and there was easier matchups for tight ends to take advantage of. So now we're seeing, tight ends line up in the slot a lot more as well. So they're drawing a safety or defensive back specifically to cover them, which makes it a lot harder as well. And I think actually, the boss Chris Collinsworth brought it up even on the broadcast on Sunday Night Football about Kyle Pitts too. When he was lined up in line, it does provide better matchups. And there was, I think I looked into it, I think last year or something like that, there was data to back that up as well, where tight ends performed better in line than they did in the slot, just because they do draw those more favorable matchups. So there's kind of a lot that goes into it, but I think you explained it very well there. And I think that makes sense for kind of, what the position is and how it's kind of changing over time, and teams will adjust to that as well, and hopefully kind of levels out here, especially as these tight ends get healthy, Nate. But you got a decent list of options here as waiver wire targets for the tight end position. So anybody that you want to go into specifically, you mentioned Zach Ertz, you've mentioned a few of the names here, but anybody that kind of stands out as maybe one of the more I guess desirable targets for you, or are they all kind of looking the same at this point?
I think all of these are probably short-term options. It's probably worth checking out the matchups in general, because I don't think there is anyone that you can get that you can really trust week after week among the waivers, because so many of these tight ends are in committees. I think Brenton Strange is starting to stand out to me more and more out of the group. He is the Jaguars tight end. He's been playing in place of Evan Ingram. And he has a fairly decent role among the tight ends. He Saw a decent number of snaps in week 2 when Evan Ingram went down with the injury right before the game. So Jacksonville kind of had to adjust on the fly. We saw Luke Farrell play a decent amount. This week, he was playing close to 100% of snaps for most of the game, and then it was just the blowout that Jacksonville started putting in more backups at the end of the game, which included at tight end. So we saw Strange not play as much near the end of the game, but we were almost in store for Strange seeing a clear career high in terms of offensive snaps. He is one of the few tight ends who is seeing a good role these past 2 weeks, and then also seeing a decent target share. Only brought in a couple of those catches this past week, but there are very few tight ends seeing both the playing time and the targets, and Strange is one of those players as long as Evan Ingram is out.
Yeah, we talked about Brenton Strange on the Start Sit podcast, and we're feeling pretty optimistic about him. Luckily, he scored the touchdown there in that mess of a Jacksonville offense from Monday night. But yeah, as long as Evan Ingram is out, that role looks pretty good, and I think there's definitely targets there to take advantage of. Yeah, other than that, I mean, you got Noah Fant on here, rostered in just 5% of leagues. And then like Colby Parkinson is rostered in 42% of leagues. I know Colby Parkinson is playing a pretty decent sized role there in the Rams offense, along with Demarcus Robinson and Tutu Atwell, who we talked about as well. So definitely a chance that, some of these guys can have big games, but it's just, figuring out consistently if they're going to do it, it makes it a little bit tougher. So maybe some more matchup dependent options kind of going forward.
Yeah, just to group the guys together, Tyler Conklin and Cole Kmet had good weeks last week, but I'm not sure if that'll continue. We've seen Conklin have a low target share basically throughout his career, and this was one good game, so don't know if that'll keep up. Cole Kmet mentioned before, but the Bears had 90-plus plays, so that played a big role in him doing well. And then Keenan Allen wasn't on the field in week 1 when Keenan Allen was the slot receiver. The Bears basically didn't look at their tight ends at all in the passing game, so once Allen is back, worried about Kmet that way, but Kmet is playing more playing time than he was, especially in week 1, but it's still Gerald Everett seeing a decent amount of work, specifically in passing situations. So a lot of times when you see a tight end playing over 75% of snaps, when they're off the field, it's often run situations, but with Kmet, it's the opposite, where he's out in passing situations. So still concerned about him from that perspective. And then Ertz, I was excited about him, but he played even less than 12 personnel last night than he had in the previous weeks. Noah Fant was another one that I started to get more and more excited about once he came back from injury, but then Pharaoh Brown was healthy this week, and Pharaoh Brown kicked Noah Fant out of the 12 personnel snaps. So even though I listed 7 different teams who had tight ends and 11 personnel, but not 12 personnel, once we get some more games, Noah Fant's going to get added to that list. So that is now 8 teams that'll be playing a tight end and 11 personnel and not 12 personnel. So even though Fant had a decent stat line this week, concerned about him that way. And then, like you said, Parkinson's like the one guy out along with Tyler Conklin who is seeing at least a good amount of snaps on offense for a tight end, just not seeing the targets consistently. And Parkinson specifically, like if he's going to see targets anytime, it's going to be with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua out, and it didn't happen too much this past game.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, let's close it out with some quarterbacks here. We've talked about Justin Fields quite a bit through the first 3 weeks of the season. Remains undefeated. So Justin Fields rostered in just 24% of ESPN leagues. I know it's been maybe a more like toned down version of Fields here in Pittsburgh, so hasn't had like that amazing, fantasy rushing upside or anything like that. But he's helping his team win football games and looks to be pretty safe as far as his starting status goes going forward here, Nate.
Yeah, considering they're 3-0, expect him to remain the starter, which has been the big thing with him recently. Had a great day passing the ball, 25 for 32, 245 yards. The big thing is he was scoring touchdowns this week, which he wasn't doing as much the first 2 weeks. Touchdown both on the ground and in the air. The thing is he's been doing a lot better as a passer, but with that, he hasn't been running quite as much. Still one of the league leaders in rushing attempts for quarterbacks, but also hasn't been breaking away big runs like we saw him do at times in Chicago. So still optimistic about him, because if he can put together the passing efficiency he's had this first 3 weeks, along with some of that rushing efficiency he had in Chicago. If he does that, he is a top 5 fantasy quarterback over the rest of the season. He just hasn't put that all together yet. So even though there are some quarterbacks that we're going to talk about that have performed better for fantasy so far, I think they are just more top 10 potential options. But because Fields has that upside running the ball, which is why I have Fields as the top waiver wire option at quarterback for a second straight week.
Yep, makes sense. And then one of the other names here, Sam Darnold of the Minnesota Vikings, has been like a top 5 fantasy quarterback so far this year. Had a big game here in week 3. Did get banged up this week, but seems like he's going to be okay. I don't think it was anything serious, and he's rostered in just 16% of leagues still.
Yeah, has been a top 6 fantasy quarterback each of the past 2 weeks. Had a great week this week. Part of that was just because he threw 4 touchdowns. So he has a pretty high targets per attempt rate, which is bound to regress at least a little bit. But as that regresses, the passing attempts will go up. He only attempted 28 passes this past week because the Vikings were scoring so much on offense. And he's been doing this without Jordan Addison the past 2 weeks. Justin Jefferson got banged up the week ago. And then TJ Hawkinson hasn't played yet. Ideally, Hawkinson rejoins the lineup at some point this season. So a chance this offense gets even better than what it's been. Darnold was my favorite sleeper quarterback heading into the season just because of how quarterback friendly this offense is. They pass the ball more than most teams, run more plays than most teams. And like last year, we saw their backup quarterbacks. Both of them had top 5 weeks as a fantasy quarterback, and they trust Darnold more than they trust those 2 quarterbacks. So expect Darnold to continue to be in this mix of a borderline top 12 quarterback the rest of the season.
Yep, I like it. And then Geno Smith of the Seattle Seahawks has been a pretty popular QB streamer option. I know for Nick in his article, we've talked about a few times now, but still available in nearly 3/4 of ESPN leagues at this point, Nate. We still like Geno Smith kind of going forward.
Oh, yeah, he's been top 12 quarterback so far this season, completed more than 75% of his passes this last week, nearly 300 yards. The big thing is the touchdown passes just haven't been there as much as other quarterbacks so far this season. So hopefully those come, but the offense has been as pass friendly as we had hoped. They are running more plays than they had in past years, and Smith has graded decently well. So I think Smith can continue doing what he's been doing. Was a top 6 or so fantasy quarterback in 2022, and he has been consistently playing well these past 3 seasons. So I think in the right matchup, Smith is definitely someone you can put in your fantasy starting lineup.
Yep, for sure. And then new name on the list. We knew it couldn't be as bad as it was for what Bryce Young was doing in the first couple of weeks. And Andy Dalton still turned out to be much better than expected. He was top 8 at least QB on the week. I haven't checked. I know he was like QB6 during last night's games, but Josh Allen and Jaden Daniels were having some pretty big games in there. So Andy Dalton put together a really nice performance here for the Carolina Panthers in his first start of the year.
Yeah, Dalton for at least one day got to be the only quarterback this season with at least 300 passing yards and 3 touchdowns in a single game this season. Joe Burrow also did that last night. So Andy Dalton only got to hold that title for a little more than 24 hours, but he did really well in his first game with Carolina. And yeah, the matchup was pretty decent, but there's a chance Dalton can continue playing well in this offense. I would expect him to gain more chemistry with his wide receivers as the season goes on. Hopefully Jonathan Brooks comes to the offense at some point, which will help in general. So for a quarterback that's only rostered in a small percentage of leagues, obviously expect Superflex leagues. He was probably picked up in most of those leagues. I picked him up in the Superflex leagues where I could pick him up, but in single quarterback leagues, there's at least a chance he could have value this season. So out of all the quarterbacks that are very widely available, I think Dalton is the top option of those quarterbacks.
Nice. I like it. So that's going to do it for us. Nice big list there. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Again, make sure you get out there, put those waiver claims in, stay active all season long. We're going to continue to do this every single Tuesday morning. And Nate has the waiver wire article out on PFF.com, which I think you're putting that out Monday morning. I think it is, Nate.
Yep, Monday mornings, decently early in the morning, whenever the editors get to it. But I have been finishing writing it around 2 a.m. Sunday or Monday morning. So.
Yeah. I listened to your recap episode that you record on Sunday night, and you're like, after I finish this, gonna go write the waiver wire article. So Nate doesn't sleep, and he does it so that you guys can have some good waiver wire options and good content to sort through when it's ready. And yeah, thank you all again for tuning in. Nate, thank you for putting this list together as always. Big shout out to the PFF data collection team as well for putting all this data together for us. But Nate, before you go, always please remind everyone what else you have going up on pff.com this week.
Sure. As always, have the recaps up on the website, the top 10 recap, the waiver wire article, like you mentioned. Today, we had the 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high go up on the website. Definitely some interesting names there. Also have the rest of season rankings where there was a bit of movement. Saquon Barkley, now my number 2 player overall, after he's been the number 1 running back 2 of 3 weeks so far this season. We'll be working on my week 2 rankings once we get, or not week 2, we're in week 4 now. Week 4 rankings. I was going backwards a week and not forward.
Yeah.
Week 4 rankings. That'll be up on the website later this afternoon. I'll be working on that once we're off here. As usual, we'll have start sit up later in the week, and then we'll get to the Thursday night recap once Thursday night hits.
There we go. Never stops. And then, yeah, as for me, I'll have the IDP fantasy report out today. That'll have the IDP waiver wire targets in there. Then the wide receiver man zone coverage report will be out on Thursday morning, as well as the IDP rankings, offensive line, defensive line matchups to target and avoid. That'll be back. I'll be back in the podcast feed again, doing the week 4 IDP preview episode. As well as the week 4 start sit episode with Nick Bodiford. So make sure to check all of those out as well. And until next time, everybody, peace out.